So yesterday I wanted to skip, but then I decided it would be a mistake to skip because this is where all the lumdus is.
This is all the action.
Yeah. So everything we've been talking about, that it was different in the time of the temple, and now now it's different, and what he mentioned last time, that during the time of the temple, the three axes of the Sfirot were combined. They had a focal point. They came together. The temple is like the lens through which all our actions in Torah, Tefillah, and Chesed, they come together. And since the temple is gone, so there's no there's no lens focusing all the light together. So the impact is much smaller. So it says, this is perhaps, says the Tzemach Tzedek, the issue that's mentioned in the Talmud, in Shabbos Nun Hey, ובמדרש רבה בחוקותיי סוף פרשה ל"ו, and this issue appears again in the Medrash, שיש מאן דאמר טעם זכות אבות. There is an opinion that the merits of the patriarchs had an expiry date, and they're over. We can't live by their merits. But there's another opinion there that zchut avot, the merits of the patriarchs are forever. They don't end.
I like
that. The one who says that they ended. So he says people saw that the moment that the temple was destroyed, the avos, their merits don't function as they did before. Meaning, exactly what we just said, that the avos, they represent the three axes, right? The left, right, and center axes. So, what do they mean? Again, the rabbinic sages, they don't use scientific language. Okay? So when they say zchut avot, when they say the merits of the sages, what do they mean to say? What do they mean to say? They don't mean to say somebody's keeping a tally. What they're saying is that the ability of their actions to come together in one focal point is gone. That's what they mean by the merit.
So therefore the schus is still kayam.
The schus is... but
the button that it's pressing is doing something else.
Okay, it's not coming together. That's what they mean by schus. They don't mean, in general, does God still account for it? Those are very strange things to say.
It's not relevant.
Okay. It would be a strange way of relating to God, which people do, but the sages were well beyond that. So when they say something like zchut avot, they don't mean how many merits or demerits they had. They're not looking at the world that way. והיינו שעל ידי זה דווקא, כן, והיינו שעל ידי זה דווקא הבונה בשמיים מעליותיו. It's something amazing here. You have to really understand this verse. This verse is from Amos chapter 9. What does it mean? He constructs in the heavens from his... Now the next word is hard to explain. It's either a sense or his attics. Like an attic. Aliyat Gag. And Aliyat Gag is an attic. What's the symbology behind it? It says in Shabbos, in the beginning of Shabbos, not here, in a different place. Here it's page 55. But on page, I think it's page 20 or 21. Right, they went up to the Aliyah of Rabbi Chanina ben Radion. What does it mean? So it means when he went there to save the book of Ezekiel, that he explained all the contradictions that they had with Moshe Rabbeinu. There were contradictions between what Yechezkel said and what the Torah says. Because Yechezkel, really, out of all the prophets, he's the only one who's down to earth. He's an architect, first of all. He describes things like an architect. But because he's so down to earth, he writes things that are halacha. He writes mamish halacha. And there were things that they couldn't, in the beginning, understand how this was the same as what Moshe Rabbeinu had written. There were contradictions. So he went up to, it says, to an aliyat gag. He went up to an attic, to an aliyah. They don't mean he went up to an attic. What they mean is he went into seclusion. He divorced himself from society. He had to sit quietly. And it took him months, because he took 300 garbei shemen, meaning he took 300 cruises of oil. A gerev really is people today in modern Hebrew use it for a sack, but it doesn't mean a sack. It means a receptacle, some kind of receptacle. So he took this with him. He needed 300 of them. He was there for a while. And then they came to him even, because in his seclusion, because they had this whole, because he realized he was in a very high spiritual state. It was the right place to finish the contradictions between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. A lot of things came out of that. So when you say that Hashem is building in the heavens his aliyot, his attics, what you're saying is he's secluded. God has secluded himself in the heavens. That's what Amos means. What does it mean? It means that after the temple was destroyed, so Hashem secludes himself in the heavens. He's not here on the earth. What do you mean he's not here on the earth? Because he's here like he's everywhere else. But what we mean to say is that when you look to find godliness in the world, it's much harder. You don't see it. And to find godliness, you have to divorce yourself from society. The Rambam says this as a halacha. And the Rambam says this as a halacha. If the world is in a bad state spiritually, so you don't have to be afraid to go into the desert. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to go into the desert physically. It could be that's the only solution, but it means that you have to divorce yourself from society to some extent. And even though in normal situation it's a sin, it's mamish a transgression to divorce yourself from society, but he says in some states that there's exceptions to the rule, and you have to divorce yourself in order to retain some level of spiritual level. So he says after the temple, Hashem retracted into the heavens. That's what it's like. Okay? And we know it from the famous mimer that the Rebbe said, the first mimer, that the Shechina in the time before Abraham retracted into the heavens, 7 levels into the heavens, and Avram started bringing it back down again. He started rectifying society so that the Shechina could come back down. So the same thing happened after the destruction of the temple. So 2 things. We see that in the Zohar it says explicitly that when there's no Beis Hamikdash, Hashem retracts above. It's like he's not present in a certain sense. In the imminent sense, he's not present. But also, and here he adds the very important pasuk here, that your mother has been cast away. What does it mean there? Your mother is Knesset Yisrael. It means the congregation of Israel. It means the source of the Jewish souls. It's been cast away. What do you mean it's been cast away? It's like she's divorced. Okay? So there's a whole discussion. The Rebbe had a beautiful sicha on this in Chelik Tes, in the 9th part of the Kutei Sichos. The second sicha, I think, on Teitzei. Explaining, because we said this was the Haftarah of Teitzei, what we're learning now. And he explains it beautifully. What exactly is this? How can you say that the congregation of Israel was divorced? First of all, it wasn't divorced. Shulcha can mean, shiluchin can mean divorce, but it also mean threw you out of the house. It doesn't mean I actually divorced you. But separate. But the Rebbe asks a number of simple questions why it can't be. One of the dinim, one of the laws in a get, is that when the husband gives the get, which is the divorce document, to the wife, he has to give it in such a way that he can't take it back. Meaning, he can snatch it back afterwards, that's his problem. But it has to be given in such a way that she's now holding it in a way that he cannot, at least now, take it away. So he says, can Hashem...
You can throw it on her porch.
Yeah, but it has to be in her possession. So in that case, we say the porch possesses it, and it's in her possession now. But if throws it on the porch and then he snatches it back and it was never really in her possession, she's probably not divorced. And it has to actually be in her possession. He says, the Rebbe says, how can, in the name of the commentaries who asked this question, how can the prophets, like Amos, like here, Yeshaya, Isaiah, how can they compare the destruction of the temple to a divorce? Because if you give a divorce, you have to give the get, and it has to be given in such a way that the husband can't take it away. Can Hashem do something like that? Can Hashem give us something that He can't take away? It doesn't make any sense. So obviously, it's just a metaphor. But the question is, what is this metaphor trying to capture? So it's not trying to capture the state of divorce itself. It's trying to capture something spiritual. And that becomes the question here. So this whole mimer here is about that. The Alter Rebbe explains that really what the divorce means, and this is like beginning to put everything into perspective, is that type of love that God had for the Jewish people, which was predicated on the acts, on the conduct of the patriarchs, is no longer relevant. That's what the pasuk that we learned in the beginning of the Maimer means. Ki ha'arim yamushu ve'hagvaot temutena, that the mountains move and the hills will fall down. It means that the reason why I loved you in the beginning, says God to the Jewish people, is no longer relevant.
So why do you still say Daphne every day? Go to Abraham, Esau, Jacob.
Because that hasn't changed. The way that we perceive Hashem is the same. Okay, but Hashem is saying, I don't perceive you the same way. What is it? What's going on here? So the best explanation really is that every man in the world, almost, I think you can say without exception, goes through at least 2 stages in his relationship with his wife. And hopefully he goes through 2. Sometimes he goes through more. The first stage is what's called chesed ne'uraych. It's called the love of our youth. And it's predicated on the loving kindness of our youth. Meaning that when the man falls in love with a woman and he wants to marry her, he's falling in love with an image of youth. That's the normal way. Normal people, that's what it's a good thing. I mean, you see a beautiful girl, or you think she's beautiful, and you see things that you're attracted to. They're mostly external. And you say, I want to live with this person. You're not in a position to really assess what it's going to be like to live with her. Because you can't. You can't know what it's like to live with anybody until you live with them. You have to actually live with them. So what do you what do you base your marriage on? You base it on something pretty external. So says Hashem says the same thing. When I fell in love with your forefathers, I fell in love with an image of what it would be to live with them like. What it would be like to live with them. What's it going to be like? Oh, the beautiful people. It's going to be all wonderful. Unfortunately, there's death in the world. And so these 3 men, they're no longer here. Who's here? They're offspring. So I'm still connected. I thought it would be the same. Then they come to Eretz Yisrael, and God now has to actually live. That's what it means, that He's now here, imminent. So He now has to live with the Jewish people. What does He find out? They're nothing like they're nothing like what I thought it would be like.
Hashem does everything before it happens anyway.
Doesn't matter. Hashem, when He came down into this world, when He decided to create this world, He limited Himself. And so He took away from His perfect knowledge. He doesn't need to have that perfect knowledge. Of course, there's a level that He always knows. But if you want the world to develop, you have to suspend your knowledge. You have to suspend your judgment. You have to suspend many things. And that's what Hashem did when He contracted Himself in order to not just create the world, but also to reveal His will and expect it to be followed. And that's what every man thinks. He thinks that now my wife is going to do what I want her to do. And what does he find out? That for very good reason, she doesn't. She doesn't do anything from what he thought she would do. And most men are lost at this stage. And so their reaction is either I'm going to leave or you're going to leave. And when you look at the destruction of the temple, that's exactly what it is. It's not just a punishment in the sense of we didn't act properly. So what? So what? So what if we didn't act properly? Are you married? Are you not married? Are you a little child? What are you doing? Because it didn't work out the way you expected it, so that's it? It's finished? Why did you get into this in the first place? Because you thought that somebody would give you the conduct that you expected? It's almost, when somebody who's not from looks at the history of the Jewish people, a Jew who's not from, I think he almost can't begin to imagine that God would destroy his house because we acted improperly. That sounds like a child. It's like a child playing with Lego. It didn't work out. Or playing with sand. What are you talking about? So obviously Hashem is not like that. Hashem is much more than that. But there is a lesson to be learned in it. And that's what the prophet is saying. That's the verse that we started with. It's a very deep verse. It's saying Hashem enclosed himself within this situation. And he says within this situation you have to understand that we're, as it were, maturing together. Hashem's of course mature, but he's taking this role in order to be with us through this process.
What about all the great tzaddikim through the generations?
Exactly.
They don't live up to Avram.
Exactly. And so what?
No, I'm asking a question.
Of course they did. There's no question. There were people that were as pious as them. They're not as great as them because they had to cut a new path in the world. And so tzaddikim that came after them were already following in their footsteps. It's much easier. But in terms of piety, they're probably greater. In terms of learning, in terms of faith in God, many things. Maybe they were much greater then. But the whole situation, you have to understand, it has to be asked, what are you doing? You're destroying your house because your wife didn't act the way you want. What's wrong with you?
Immature.
That's very immature. That's childlike. The answer is, again, that every man goes through this.
But on the other hand, people do get divorced.
Which is very painful and sad, and the wrong answer. Usually the wrong answer. 95% out of the times that people get divorced, that was the wrong answer. What's the right answer? The right answer is what he says at the end of the verse that we started with. Chasdi mi'itech lo yamush, uvriti shalom itach. I came to a realization that the reason that we're together is not for my gratification. It's a scary thought when you really think about it. I'm not in this marriage. The man has to come to a realization. I'm not in this marriage to get dinner. I'm not in this marriage to get positive reinforcement every time I do something wrong. I'm in this marriage to be serious. I'm seriously here. And what does it mean to be serious? To be serious means to be who you are. What is your role? Your role is to give. Your role is to be a mashpia. The mashpia, imagine a teacher in school who, if the children misbehave, he doesn't just take a child out, which in itself is one of the worst possible solutions to a problem, but sometimes maybe you say for a while there's no other choice. Again, I have to take him out for 10 minutes, for 20 minutes to go to the principal, whatever. But you can't, if you have to send him home, you failed. So imagine that the teacher in the school would say, it's not just that I'm taking the children, everybody out of the classroom. I'm setting fire to it. Afterwards, no classroom. That's not the answer. You don't understand what it means to be a teacher. Even if it doesn't work out, even if none of the children learn anything at all, the whole year, what do you need to teach them? You need to teach them something else then, patience. Patience. You have to teach them perseverance. You have to teach them faith. You have to teach them many things by not burning the house down. But Hashem didn't do that. So he comes and says, that was like sending you out to the principal. But when I rebuild the temple, it's not going to be predicated on anything. That's why, again, we talked about this in one of the last week. That a lot of the commentaries look at the second temple and they say it's not separate from the first. It's just another iteration of the first. That the whole succession of the first and second temples are one thing.
The third one is going to be different.
The third one is really the second one. And that's what they call Habayit HaAcharon. Which means...
The third one's going to have the Urim and the Tumim.
What?
The third one's going to have all the pieces.
Yeah, it'll be like the first one in the sense of having all the pieces, all the vessels. But again, the idea here is that you can't base marriage on give and take. You can't. It can't be that the marriage is in question if you don't get what you want. Because if the marriage is your most important commitment in life, how can you ruin it? Either you're committed to it or you're not. What's the only situation in which you might say, this can't go on? Is when people begin to endanger one another. And if the marriage is such that there's such violence that it's endangering one or the other, and violence can quickly deteriorate. So there's you have to put a hard limit at some point. And you say, if there's any slapping or anything like that, at least from the part of the husband to the wife, and sometimes from the wife to the husband also. So this is not going to work. But as long as you're not physically abusive, commitment requires that, as difficult as it is, you have to stay with it. You have to stick with it, because your role as a male is to be mashpia, and your wife has another role. Her role also she has to take care of, even if it's very difficult. So it's easy for me to say because I have the most wonderful marriage in the world. I don't even understand what the people who come to me for marriage counseling. I listen to them and I'm like, what's wrong with you? Or I'm in disbelief. How can this even be? How can two people act this way to one another? I don't understand. But I know that it's not because of my merits. It's because of my wife's. So I sort of understand that if I was with somebody else, I would probably be in the same boat. Okay. But that's what Hashem is saying, that when I rebuild our relationship, I'm not going to predicate it on your behavior. What does this mean? It means that the next time we're going to have a relationship, don't expect me to punish you if you do something wrong. I'm mature now, as it were. I'm assuming now the role of the mature husband who understands that he's committed to this because he's committed to this. That's what he wants to teach you. And that's what he says, that the next level of chesed that I'm going to show you is not the regular chesed. It's called Rav chesed. It's the chesed from the Keter. That's where we're going here. That when you're all out of the regular love, which is the love of youth, which is expectations. It's based on expectations. Then you come to the real mature love, or loving kindness. And that mature love, loving kindness, is not based on schut. It's not based on merits or demerits. It's not a cheshbon. It's not an accounting. You don't take an accounting of how many times did you bring me coffee today. You don't. That's not the point. It's not the point about whether you did what I think you should do or you didn't do what I think you should do. You're a mature person. You should decide what you want to do yourself. You'll pay the consequences anyway. Can we live together in spite of the fact you don't do what I think you need to do? Yes, we can live together. We'll figure it out. That's what Hashem is saying. That's why this whole sugya is related. Good. Okay, so we need to go.
Yeah, we need to go.
So that you feel better. We're leaving 3 minutes early.
No. We said 22, no?
No, we said 1:45. Okay, we'll continue tomorrow. Bezat Hashem.
What happened to